of the day, which is Patricia Owens and Jonathan Joseph, who may or may not go into combat over to the social, but if they don't, hopefully the audience will show no mercy.
I think you're on the most vulnerable person.
Yeah. So, Jonathan is going to go first, and then Patricia will speak for 15 minutes each, and then there'll be questions.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm still trying to work out why I have been invited, because I don't know much about state building, to be perfectly brutal. However, I have written a book which is called The Social in the Global, and the subtitle is Social Theory, Governmentality and Global Politics. And I guess if the jigsaw pieces fit together, then what I'm supposed to say is that having done a little bit of research on state building, I've discovered that actually the discourse is very similar to the discourse that I've been studying in the book. In the book, I've been mainly looking at the broad idea of global governance and transnational governance. And I say both because one thing I did was to look at different institutions, and I looked at the EU and I looked at the World Bank, mainly its poverty reduction strategies. And my aim there was to try to show how they're actually singing from a very similar discourse or discursive hymn sheet. And that the language is very similar, and that the assumptions, more importantly, the assumptions behind the language are the same. And so in my brief investigation into the state building literature, I've thankfully discovered that the language is also very similar, and that the assumptions are also very similar, and the kind of assumptions I think which have come out already today and have been discussed so far. So this is an ongoing dialogue, I guess. This discourse of these organisations is the kind of words which we've been talking about already. So to switch from state building to poverty reduction, for example, we see exactly the same discourse of partnership, ownership, local ownership, if you want to call it that, empowerment, as if these agents were not empowered before, but thanks to the intervention they will be. Stakeholding hasn't been mentioned yet, but that's another big one. I don't know if that's really big in the state building literature, but it must be surely. Capacity building, of course. And it's some things which we haven't talked much about, but I know that people like David do talk about them. Resilience, this is a big concept we've been discussing recently. Good governance and networking. We haven't talked about networks yet. We've been talking a lot about causality without mentioning networks, but the big onslaught on the idea of causality at the moment is coming from network theory and active network theory, and under its new guise of the new materialism. So that's something I think worth talking about. However, I think things like partnership, ownership, stakeholding, empowerment, capacity, networks, good governance, resilience, ultimately I don't want to give those terms too much philosophical credence. I think they're buzzwords, and you could quite easily cross the word out and replace it with another word and it would do the same job. So more interesting to me are the underlying assumptions, the ontological assumptions, if you like. I use that word deliberately because that's another one of the words which we're not supposed to talk about in our new post-theoretical world, ontologies. But by ontology I mean, the kind of assumptions we make about the world and our role within it and the actors within it and the kind of agency that one might have. And there I think we find this kind of more deeper problematic set of assumptions that underpins all of this literature. So what sort of terms theories come up in this deeper ontology? Well, the first one on our list is a very unfashionable one, globalization. And of course, if I got up and said this at the latest trendy conference, people would have laughed and said, globalization, that term's years out of date, nobody talks about it anymore. But the term's not really gone away. I mean, people do now say, well, globalization, what does it really mean? But they substitute alternative words for globalization. So, the concept is still playing an active role. And it underpins other concepts which are crucial in the world of state building, in the discourse of international relations. It underpins the concepts of global civil society, it underpins the idea of global governance. So its role cannot be underestimated. Networks I haven't mentioned, people haven't mentioned, but for me it's a big thing, this switch to the focus on networks. is playing a big role. The idea that we live in a world beyond stable structures, where everything is in flux, everything is in flow, that plays a big role in constructing a different type of social ontology. And also, of course, the whole debate about space and time and how that's changed. Again, that's a bit out of date now. People think Anthony Giddens, the kind of lifting of ourselves out of social relations. But the new, more trendy version of it simply replaces discussion about time and space with discussion about complexity, fluidity, mobility, and so on and so forth. And then the other underpinning idea is perhaps a bit more concrete. It's something like civil society or global civil society or social capital. Again, these are terms which are already being dated, but what they get at is some sort of notion of a relationship, as David was talking earlier on about, between the social and the political and the state and sovereignty and so on and so forth. Now, I have negative, you might have guessed by now, I have a negative opinion about these trends, and I find them debilitating. And so I want to go back to a good old-fashioned way of seeing the world, which is before sociology was attacked from within, which is the structure agency world, which we heard previously about. And the idea that one can analyse these processes according to the certain structure of a world and the powers and the liabilities and the causal agency that we have within it. And so it's not surprising, I think, that this kind of discourse, this traditional discourse, is coming under attack from this new way of seeing the world. What I find so interesting, though, is the way in which it's being done in the most practical spheres. So normally this kind of stuff would have been, say, 15 years ago, would have been confined to philosophical discussion about ontology, about structure agency. This kind of stuff was not considered practical enough to have an engagement in the world. But now it underpins, these assumptions underpin the actual practical engagements, most pertinently here, of state building. So it paints a particular picture of the world in order for the practices, the more mundane practices of state building to then take effect. So that's why I called my book The Social and the Global, because before one can have the global, one needs to socially conceptualize it. And it's by conceptualizing the social or the international in this particular way that the more mundane everyday practices, the micropolitics of state building or poverty reduction or European Union integration can be achieved. So how does this actually work? Well, I think three areas I'd want to highlight. One is the redefinition of structure, one is the redefinition of agency, and the other, which combines both, is the redefinition of the state. So redefining structure now takes shape through a focus on networks, as I say, or through a focus on complexity, or through a focus on contingency. What these do is that they suggest that we've moved away from a world where you can clearly define structural processes, causal mechanisms, cause and effect, to a world where everything is in flux, nothing can be accounted for anymore in any kind of scientific kind of way, and where the world is completely beyond our control. Now, that has two effects, macro and micro. At the macro level, its effect is to construct a picture of a world which is beyond our control, or what Giddens calls the runaway world, the juggernaut that we can steer but which we can't control. And that's behind the kind of assault on the political with a capital P. And I must emphasise the capital P political, which is being attacked here. I'll go into the uppercase, lowercase thing a bit later on. So attacking the political with a capital P means showing that we are overwhelmed by these macro-social forces over which we have no control whatsoever. We used to call it globalization, but now we have trendy terms like complexity, networks, flows, and so on to do the job for us. And then at the micro level, its role is to responsibilize us. So this is the redefinition of agency. Given that everything is beyond our control, adaptation is now key to the game. That's why resilience is such an important concept. We can't control these external shocks anymore. I'm stealing David's ideas. We can't control these external events anymore. So we have to adapt our own individual agency. But of course, it isn't agency anymore in the way we used to understand it. It's responsibilized agency. So that then leads to a redefinition of the state in terms of things like capacity, responsibility, micro, macro level adaptation, etc., etc. And I think that's where the kind of state discourse fits in. So how long have I got?
You've got another 6 minutes.
6 minutes. So the 6 minutes I've got left, I'll devote to attacking David. Because the last time we got on the stage together to talk about resilience, I think you promised you were going to attack me, weren't you? So I spent the entire interval preparing a counter-offensive, and then you didn't. It's not a big disagreement. As always, I mean, David's ideas are greatly inspiring, and it's just that you like to provoke people. And I think the clear example of that was this morning, where you threw everything kitchen sink approach to the social in order to provoke us, which of course always works, because here I am talking about it. But I want to take issue with you on something which you haven't talked about that much yet, but is this idea that we then therefore move to a post-liberal phase. Because I don't agree with this idea we should call it post-liberal. In fact, I think it's dangerous to call it post-liberal. I think we need to keep liberalism in there somehow. So my concession to you is this capital letter business. I said we're having politics with a capital P being replaced with politics with a small lowercase p. And I think, likewise, we're having liberalism with a capital L being replaced by liberalism with a small l. And I think that's what's going on. It's not post-liberal, it's just liberal with a small l. And that liberal with a small l is, for me, shorthand for governmentality. So that's the second term in my subtitle of the book, which is coming out in September. It's cost £60. Yeah, so far. I think they're going to be paperback, but they want to sell it online. So I think it's the uppercase, lowercase issue that's going on here, and so I don't want to call it post-liberal. I want to call it neoliberalism, neoliberal governmentality. And the reason why is because neoliberalism has never been any of those things that we claim liberalism to be. It precisely distinguishes itself from this kind of ideal type, rational actor, autonomous model of the liberal, and it also distinguishes itself importantly from the human rights discourse. So when you say, for example, oh, this can't be liberalism anymore because it's dispensing with the idea of autonomy, or it's problematizing autonomy, I'd say that's precisely a defining point of neoliberalism. It's precisely in problematizing the autonomous individual that neoliberalism is able to responsibilize the individual. And that responsibilization is a defining feature of the neoliberal agenda. So I don't know if we have a major metaphysical dispute here, but for practical reasons and for political reasons, political with a capital P, I want to emphasize that it's not the end of liberalism, but a small lowercase l, which is characteristic of a broader shift from capital letters to lowercase letters, from government with a capital G to governance with a small g, for example, from social with a big S to the social with a small s. And that this new liberalism is a neoliberalism, and there's no such thing as neoliberalism either. Neoliberalism is this kind of amorphous thing which takes many different shapes. That's precisely why it's neo. It always understands itself on the basis of its own reflexivity. But also, very importantly, to paraphrase John Ruggie, who stole the phrase from Polanyi, it's an embedded neoliberalism. So this embeddedness is important, and that's what I think is lost from calling it post-liberalism, because it almost suggests like it's disembedded itself. It almost goes down the Giddens route of disembedding, and it's this shift which is ultimately a political shift caused by the crisis of the post-war order, the reorganisation of the institutional architecture, and the emergence of the new global governance discourse. That this is an embedded neoliberalism of a small L type, and that's our enemy, and that's where the big politics of a capital B has to turn its attention in order to reclaim itself, I guess.
I was especially excited by the title of the conference, and because I've been thinking about the overarching theme for some time now, this distinction between the social and the political. How should we think about these terms historically and theoretically? Are they equivalent concepts? as you know, the political has been central to large-scale human organization since the Greeks, but the discourse of state building precedes the discourse of the social by about 2 centuries. So the question I think is interesting is what were the conditions for the emergence of the social realm within and then eventually across supposedly distinct national societies? Why did the social join economy and politics and war as a domain understood to possess specific norms and logics through which human life could be acted on and transformed? Why did social theory and then sociology and social policy develop into a particular intellectual genre with a specific vocabulary that was subsequently imported into international theory? So the paper I'm presenting today, and I'm also circulating, so I have some copies if people are interested, is part of a broader project that tries to answer these questions. And the project is born with 2 sources of dissatisfaction with existing international thought. First is the ahistoricism of much of the so-called social turn, including amongst critical and historical international theory, that really takes the concept of the social to be a timeless and universally applicable concept. For about 20 years now, or more than that, debate has tended to center on the degree to which the international is a particular kind of social system, and how socialization and social systems should be philosophically understood. Yet the idea of an identifiable social realm, and along with it, social explanations for political and economic developments are a relatively new phenomena, right? Only around 180 years old. Even historically informed Marxists and Weberians usually assume what is to be explained, that is, the use of terminology largely derived from late 18th and 19th century bourgeois thought. And I think that there's something really unsatisfactory with the way social theory has been imported into international studies in lieu of a proper history of the social. And so my second area of frustration, and you know, I'm sort of going like this during David's talk, if I admit that, is the frequent blurring of the distinction between what I think are real phenomenological distinctions between social, political, and war-making activities. This is certainly true of realism and liberalism, but again, also of more critical theories. For example, Foucault's work on biopolitics partly captures one important element of what we can think of as the rise of the social, namely increasing levels of intervention into the biological life of populations. However, I think biopolitics is less the essence of contemporary relations of power than one element of something broader. And this is the rise of the social as the arena for the management of collective needs under capitalism. So the biopolitical literature has thus far failed to distinguish between bio and politics, between political action and the social regulation of life. And I think the major source of this failure, and this is not just a critique of Foucauldian biopolitics literatures, but the source of this failure is itself found in the historical rise of the social realm, the dominance of specifically social forms of governance and thought at the expense of properly political theory. So the claim rests on the idea then that there is a meaningful distinction that can be drawn between the social and the political, but that these are not equivalent concepts. So the social, I think, needs to be understood as a historically specific formation associated with capitalist government, in which the life processes of populations are managed. It is about his administration, and I think that claim is supported by simply the history of thought. The political, on the other hand, is a fundamental human activity that is not reducible to capitalism or government. So where the social rose historically with capitalism, that is not the case of the political. It is a fundamental human activity, and it is not reducible to government or governmentality, even though governmentality is associated with the social. The broader project then is a study then of the historical specificity and relatively recent invention of the social across 3 domains. So as a concrete historical entity, you know, when and where did the social emerge as a really existing historical entity? Then as a category of political and philosophical thought, so discourses of the social theories and so on. But also, and this is the relevance for this conference, as a military and political strategy, that the social itself became part of political and military strategy. And corresponding to historical, theoretical, and empirical research with these three domains, I make three interrelated claims. First, as I've already implied, the definition and meaning of the social can only be understood in the context of a specific historical constellation. So while it's possible, although anachronistic, to describe forms of social regulation in pre- and non-capitalist times and locales, the social emerged as a distinctly capitalist form of public regulation. So the way that I conceptualize that and give an ontology to the social is to show how activities and relations of dependency, once contained within ancient feudal households, became matters of state concern and regulation in response to transformations in the economy. So I think you can trace this concept and changes in the structure of households, and that tells you about the emergence and the rise of the social. My second claim is that taking seriously this history of the social has big consequences for how we think about the main theories of politics and international politics. Almost all derived from the political ideologies of the 19th century, and hence parasitic on the rise of the social. The 19th century really is the age of the social. International theories reproduce social discourses in various ways. I think we had a wonderful example from Jonathan. In fact, different international theories are actually fragments of what could be considered competing paradigms of social regulation. Paradigms of social regulation are the distinctive ideological and cultural frames for understanding how threats emanating from the social are conceptualized and solved. These paradigms matter because they represent different ways of imagining the social realm and its fault lines and attempts at its reorganization, which of course is the intervention state building project. So the third claim I want to make is that paying attention to the rise and transformation, continual transformation of social forms of governance yields new analysis of some important developments in contemporary intervention and state building. And the paper I'm presenting today, which has just come out in the European Journal of International Relations, supports this claim with the case of population-centric counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, which I describe as a form of Bismarckian realpolitik. That's the paradigm of social regulation that I think is at work in the counterinsurgency strategy. Before getting to this, I'd like to say more about the modern social itself. What is the ontology of the social? How and when did it emerge? With Hannah Arendt, I think the best way to approach this is through an analysis of changes in the institution of the household and related distinctions between public and private. Households are not the same as houses or homes, nor are they confined to kinship relations. As Spike Peterson's recently put it, the emphasis lies in the pooling of diverse material and non-material resources with the purpose of ensuring the continuity of the collective unit. So households are the organizations in which the life processes of its members are reproduced. And of course, they are therefore shaped by gendered, sexual, and intracommunal hierarchies. And as Arendt noted 20 years before Foucault, life processes are closely associated with the biological and laboring activities, that they're necessary, they're repetitive, they're cyclical, and they usually involve violent subordination. Certain parts of the population are to predominantly engage in the reproduction of the life processes, and others are not. So for example, in antiquity, human affairs were organized around this binary distinction between the household and the public realm, between the oikos and the polis. The private household was where women and slaves tended to the needs of life, where male citizens debated the common political affairs. And this is the origins of our conception of politics and the political. In ancient Greece, there was no such thing as the social realm or society as a mediating domain between polis and oikos, public and private. To be social simply meant to be friendly or genial, and actually up until the 17th century, that was the meaning of the term social. Under feudalism, in contrast to the ancients, there was no clear distinction between polis and oikos, public and private, politics and economy. Production, reproduction, and so-called politics, really I think domination, were combined through the institution of lordship, right, which retained a necessary relation to the land like one individual household. So this household was not simply the underlying foundation for the wider community, as with the Greeks. They were fused into one, and this is defining of feudal arrangements. With the rise of capitalist markets, a new distinction emerged between the state public administration and the privatized economy. increasingly, as Habermas talks about in the structural transformation of the public sphere, increasingly concentrated in national and territorial states, public power rose above a privatized society. Through the course of the 18th century, bourgeois civil society was distinguished from the state and market. Politics and economy were given new meanings and distinguished from each other in a very particular way. And so when we talk about, I think when David's talking about politics, he's talking about that meaning that was given to the term politics then, rather than a broader conception of the political. As Rousseau pointed out, economy, a word derived from oikos, meaning house, ordinarily signified the wise and legitimate management of a household, but was now extended to mean the management of the larger family of the state. This was this idea of the household and managing the larger family of the state is integral in a way to the idea of political economy and economy as a distinctive form of practice, which itself is also quite relatively recent. Modern society then became conceptualized and acted on as a kind of mass or multitude of households. In other words, activities and relations of dependency once rooted in ancient feudal households become a matter of state concern, that is, they acquire their own public domain. This domain is the social realm. So the social emerged as an entity that was not wholly political or economic, public or private, but a hybrid for the management of life processes under capitalism. And in the intellectual domain then, classical political theory was joined with, and for some, superseded by social theory. Right? Social theory became this new overarching discourse about the social world, purporting to have social explanations for every other state of affairs. I think the title of Jonathan's book really captures this, the social and the global. I mean, why did it take so long for IR to import social theory? Both are incredibly imperialistic, claiming to explain and have a kind of account of everything. So I'd like to very quickly turn to one particular paradigm of social regulation, that of realpolitik, and then suggest its relevance for intervention and state building. During the course of the 19th century, classical bourgeois civil society underwent a major structural transformation. New industrial working classes were subject to a vulnerability of economic convulsions never seen before. The class dimension is really crucial here, especially after the revolutionary wave of 1848 and more organized workers' rebellions. The earliest and most important concern of sociology, a term coined in 1838, was formulated as a question, the social question. Was it possible, and if so how, to manage the welfare of the working poor such that capitalism itself was not overthrown in favor of collective management of production? And the most powerful responses to this urgent query was found in the 19th century reform agendas, welfare reform agendas. And so social policies emerged as state, and now of course increasingly non-state and transnational interventions to pacify problems emerging from the social realm. Liberal, conservative and socialist ideologies emerged in this context, debating the relative weight of repression, moral reform and personal responsibility and outright revolution in response to the social question. For political realists who can advocate both liberal and conservative strategies in response to the social question, but were self-consciously anti-socialist, social policy performed, as we all know, a particular function for state power. Above all, for realists, the modern state, as we know, is shaped by its foundation in violence and role in maintaining capitalism. And this is the context for Weber's political and international theories. Bismarck's first introduction of comprehensive national insurance, the most advanced of its kind, to be then studied by the newly invented field of sociology and social policy. These are the origins of social theory and social policy. I want to suggest that this convergence between realpolitik and sociopolitik is really important for understanding a version of the social question that animates the latest generation of really ambitious military and political strategists in Afghanistan. Is it possible, and if so how, to successfully create an Afghan social realm as a form of political and military pacification, an entity that can be intervened in and regulated to counter the military and political authority of the Taliban? So, we all know that the purported aim of counterinsurgency is not to achieve a decisive military victory, but to pacify and co-opt the population whom insurgents wish to govern. And this is the role of social policy in Afghanistan, less to protect than to constitute a national social entity, a national people that can be sufficiently governed from Kabul and so on. And so in the paper I sort of go through the field manual and also specific cases of social interventions within the population-centric strategy in Afghanistan, and showing how these can be understood through this more historical way of thinking about the social. I can't go into any of those examples now. I'll just conclude by saying that international theory is not in a really good position to theorize the distinction between the social and the political, because it takes for granted the existence of the social. It adopts the methods of the new science of society and asks whether, it asks how, rather than whether social theory is the best place to begin constructing our theories of world politics. And I think that is something that we need to not assume, but really kind of interrogate properly before we do that. I have to end, sorry.
Right. Thank you.